Today's daf is daf lamed vav, and what we did last shir was lifasan shel kelim tmeim osartam. So we spoke about the fact that when you have iser that's in a kli, the walls of the kli absorb that taste of the iser, and that is the reason why the oils that you buy from the idol worshippers are prohibited, because they come in kelim and they absorb that taste of the kli. And then the Gemara says, well, so what happens if they absorb the taste of the kli? The answer is they become tameh, that there's an issue of tuma with regard to these containers, and therefore the Gemara rejects this approach because not every Jew is careful about tuma, only the select few. And therefore we have to substitute for the tuma issue a kashrus issue. Ella slifasan shel kelim is where we finished yesterday. Asurim osratan. What generates the iser on the oil is the fact that there are non-kosher products that were cooked in those utensils, and therefore the walls of the utensils absorb that non-kosher taste. And as a result, if you were to buy these oils, you'd get oils with the taste, the flavor of the iser that is polate into the oil. Now, there was an opinion of Rav, and it was an opinion of Shmuel. Amalei Shmuel, Rav says, Shmuel says to Rav, Bishlem L'didi, according to my understanding, that there's a kashrus issue here because there's a flavor of iser that penetrates into the oil. Is the amino zlifosel kel masur masor sasan is hainu. Now we can explain the statement of Rav Yitzchak bar Shmuel, the son of Marta, who came from Eretz Yisrael, and he said, Dorish Rebbe Simlai. There was a public statement or ruling of Rabbi Simlai in a place called Nitzivin. And he said that shemen, when you buy oil from the idolaters, is Rabbi Yehuda Beis Dino Nimnu Olav V'Tiru, that at some point in history, later on, after the Rabbanan established that you're not allowed to buy and use the oil from the idolaters, Rabbi Yehuda, who's the grandson of Rabbi Yehuda Nossi, would gather together his Beis Din, and they would permit the oils of Goyim. Kasavar. Now, what could that be? I mean, if there's a flavor of Iser that's embedded in the walls of the utensils, and now it gives forth a flavor into the oil, then how could it possibly be that Rabbi Yehuda would be matir? He would allow you to use the oil. And we have a principle called tam ki'ikar, that the flavor is like the be'en itself, like the essence of the object. So where it says kasavar nosin tam lifgam mutter, meaning that the flavor that was absorbed into the walls of the utensil has been sitting in the walls of the utensil for over 24 hours. And after 24 hours, the tam, that taste, that flavor of Isa becomes a tam lifgam, pogu. It's like, if I can give you an extreme example, let's say a mouse would fall into a barrel of, I don't know what, of beer or something, or wine. So the taste of the dead, the dead rat would be lifgam. It's just a negative, detrimental kind of taste. And we're holding now, says Shmuel in the name of Rabbi Yehuda Nossi, that no Saint Tam lifgam is mutter. But according to you, Rav, and you said that this was a much earlier gzera of Daniel who gazar alav. Notice the whole issue of oil would be to marchik us from the goyim, so we wouldn't drink their wines and go to their parties and intermarry with them. So then, once Daniel, according to you, Rav, made that gzera, is also Rabbi Yehuda Nossi mevatale? Can Rabbi Yehuda Nossi come along and nullify the original Gzeir of Daniel, Vatnan, we have a Mishnah, Ein Bezin Yochel Avatel Divrei Bezin Shel Chavero, Elam Kein Gadol Menu B'Chochma V'Minyan. A second Bezdin cannot revoke a decision of an earlier Bezdin and abolish their Gzeros unless the second Bezdin is greater than the first Bezdin in two ways, Chachma and Minyan, meaning the head of the Bezdin is the great scholar who supersedes the scholarship of the original first Bezdin. And that's impossible in the case of Daniel because Daniel and his Bezdin was way, way beyond the level of Rav Yehuda Nasi. And secondly, it's got to be b'chachma u'b'minyan. It has to also be b'minyan. Some say that minyan refers to the age of the head of the Bezdin, the highest scholar. But Pashat Pshat minyan means the number of scholars that came to that decision and participated in the vote to establish that edict, that gzera. And therefore, now the Gemara is asking, it's impossible for the Bezdin of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi to override the original gzera of Daniel because, with all due respect to the Bezdin of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, they're not superior to the original Bezdin of Daniel. Amalei, so now Rav, in defense, says to Shmuel, he responds, Simloi Luda Kamrina. You're basing yourself on a statement of Rabbi Simloi. Rabbi Simloi came from Lud, so he's called Luda'a. And we don't rely on the transmission of Simloi Luda. And therefore, we're not going to trust this transmission that Rav Simloi says that the original Gzera was a Gzera of Bezdin Shel Daniel. And why not? Because Shani Ludoi de Mezalzele, when it comes to these Gzeros de Rabbanon, the Ludoim, those who came from Lud, they were known to be very flippant and very light about all these Gzeros. They didn't take it seriously. And therefore, if he's going to tell you that there was a Gzera, there wasn't a Gzera, they repealed the Gzera, and so forth and so on, why should we trust him? And Rav is basically shooting out a very strong, I don't want to call it an insult, but certainly shooting an arrow against Rav Simloi. And he's saying that don't rely on Rav Simloi when he reports that Rav Yehuda Nasi rescinded the ban on oil. We don't trust him on that. And Amalei and Shmuel responds to Rav, whoa, these are very strong words on your part that we don't rely on the statement and the transmission of Rav Simloi. Eshachlei, should I send word back in your name to Rav Simloi and tell him what you said about him? Ichsa. At that point, Rav gets very embarrassed. He realizes that he overstepped his bounds by saying we're not going to rely on Rav Simloi, and he's going to do tshuva. But he's saying that I don't understand how you could possibly tell me that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi would have repealed the original Gzera of Daniel. Im heim lo darshu, anan lo darshinon. There's going to be a drasha based on a pasuk in Daniel, and if you guys don't have that drasha, at least I have that drasha. For Ksiv, it says, "Vayasem Daniel al libo asher lo yizgoel v'pas bag hamelech ubiyein mishtav." So we'll translate this into English. And Daniel set in his heart that he would not be defiled by the king's bread food, nor by the wine of his drinks. So in a sense, Daniel was makabel on himself that he won't defile himself by eating the bread or drinking the wine of these idolaters. B'shtei mishtos hakosim medaber, And the pasuk says mishtov, yain mishtov, the wine of his drinks in the plural. And therefore the pasuk is speaking of two different drinks, echad mishta yayin, echad mishta shemen. So in other words, we see that Daniel instituted this decree prohibiting the consumption of not only the wine of idolaters, but also the oil of idolaters. And therefore, says Rav, it's very hard to believe that after Daniel made this decree and instituted this gzera, now Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is going to come and repeal that gzera. Now, when it says in the pasuk Vayasim Daniel al libo, Rav Savra al libo sam ulechol Yisrael hora. In other words, the al libo here is telling us that he gathered together his initiative and he decided that he would rule this way in his court for all of Israel. Shmuel Savra al libo sam ulechol Yisrael hora. But Shmuel was of the opinion that Daniel only had it in his heart. He set out to do this, but in reality, he didn't rule this for all of Israel. So therefore, according to Shmuel, it's very possible that since although Daniel had this in his heart, and he had set his mind to institute the Gzera, but he never did, and therefore Rabbi Yehuda Nasi could come and say that the oil of Akum is mutter. That's according to Shmuel. But according to Rav, Rav is saying that when it says Belibo, what does it mean, Belibo? It means that he made that decision in his heart and he went ahead and he implemented that decision. He gathered together his court and they established that we don't drink oil from idolaters. And therefore, again, Rav Lishitaso finds it very uncomfortable to assume that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi would have repealed a Gzera of Daniel. So the Gemara asks a kasha from a statement of Avimi. The Shemen Daniel Gozar? Are you telling me, Rav, the way you interpret the pasuk in Daniel, that it says Nasan al libo, it means he made a decree. Va'amar bali omar avimi nusa mishmei de Rav, and now we're quoting Rav himself. Piton, Shamnam, Yenam, Ubrosem. 4 categories here were included in the decree Kula Mishmona Sardoverhem. In the Gemara and Shabbos, there's a record of 18 different gzeros that were instituted by the Talmidim of Hillel and Shammai. And amongst the 18, we find the gzeros of Pas Akum, Shemen Akum, Yayin Akum, and Benoseim. We'll see what Benoseim is all about. So, Rav, you yourself go on record as saying that the original ban on the oil of Ovdei Avoda Zara was enacted by the disciples of Hillel and Shammai at the time of the Tanoim, long after the time of Daniel. So how can you tell me on the one hand that these enactments, including Shemen of Akum, were enacted by Hillel and Shammai, the Talmidim, when you're claiming, Rav, that it was enacted already by the time of Daniel of Bezdino, way before Hillel and Shammai? V'chi tema, the Gemara already anticipates a very simple answer. Also, Daniel v'Gazav v'lo kibel. Maybe Daniel tried to do this, and the people never accepted the Gzera. And this we're going to discuss later on, that if a Gzera was not accepted by the people, call it in American constitutional law, you call it the system of checks and balances, then we repeal the Gzera. That can't be. And then you want to say, we also tell me each other goes for Kibel. Then, although the people were not ready and ripe to accept Daniel's Gzera, but they accepted the same identical Gzera at the time of Hillel and Shammai, Im Kain, Maya Sadusa Dera. So why did Rav have to give you this whole asadusa, this whole edus, telling us that the decree was established by Daniel? Because Rav testified that the original Gzeir against Shema and Akum was instituted by Daniel, but that's not true because now you're saying that it was instituted by Hillel and Shammai because the Gzeira of Daniel was not accepted. Ella says the Gemara, you know what? Let's make a split. On the one hand, Daniel made a Gzeira and it was accepted, it was valid. On the other hand, in another area, there was a Gzeira of Hillel and Shammai that wasn't included in the original Gzeira of Daniel. El Daniel Gazer Olav Be'ir. Daniel said that in the city where there's a lot of mingling with the other nations, we're not going to drink or fry with the oil of the Goyim. But Yasuinu and came along the Talmid of Hillel and Shammai v'Gazer Afilu B'Sada. And as we said yesterday already, that out in the Sada is not that much social interaction, and therefore there's no chash of intermarriage. So the Gemara now says, wait a minute, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, Hechi Motzi Lemishi Takanta Talmidim Shammai v'Hillel. I mean, Talmidim of Hillel and Shammai goes back to like first generation Tanoim, and now you're saying that comes along Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and he repeals the takana, the enactment and the institution that was enacted by Hillel and Shammai. It doesn't make sense that the Bezdin of Shammai and Hillel could be greater than that of, I'm sorry, it doesn't make sense that the Bezdin of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi could be greater than the Bezdin of Talmidei Hillel v'Shammai, which was very much earlier. And therefore, it doesn't make sense that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi could repeal the Gzeira of Talmidei Hillel and Shammai. V'yod, and furthermore, Ha'omar Rabbi Bechol Bakol Yochel Avatel Bezdin Divrei Bezdin Chavero Chutz Mishmona Davar. There are 18 decrees that cannot be repealed. Shafilu Elio and Yovo Elio Bezdino Ein Shomilo. We don't listen to Elio when he comes in Mitzvah Hashem. These are the 18 Gzeros that are solid, rock solid, and cannot be shooken up. So more answers on Rav Misharshia Matam. What's the reason that these 18 Gzeros are so powerful that they can never be repealed? Hoil, since Upashadi Super of Yisrael, most of the Jewish people have accepted these 18 Gzeros. Is Shemen lo Pashad Isuro be Yisrael, Berov Yisrael. The Gzera of Shemen of idolaters was not widely received. It wasn't spread throughout Israel. And how do I know this? The Omer Rab Shmuel bar Abba Rab Yochanan Yashvu Rab Hosseinu Bodku al Shemen Shelo Pashad Isur Berov Yisrael. Right, our Rebbeim investigated the situation of the oil of Ovdei Avodas Kochavim, and guess what they found out? That this special oil, or the special prohibition, did not spread throughout most of Israel. We'll see what that is all about. So what we're saying is that you could repeal an early Gzeira if the early Gzeira was not widespread and not accepted. So it was imposed on the public on the condition that the public accept Gzeira. But not so in the case of the 18 Gzeros. There, the 18 Gzeros were widely accepted, applauded, and you cannot revoke them under any circumstances. The Omer of Ado bar Ava, Mikra, he wants to find a source in Scripture to derive this conclusion. Meaning that once Rov Yisrael accepts the Gzeira, then it's impossible to overturn the Gzeira.